The first thing Padre Antonio Rizzo noticed about the dead man was his shoes. They were Italian leather, hand-stitched, ox-blood dark, buffed to a mirror shine, and they looked obscene against the wet cobblestones of the Piazza Sant'Angelo. One foot pointed east, the other had twisted at an angle that told the story before anyone needed to speak it aloud. His brother had not simply fallen, he had been thrown. Antonio stood at the edge of the yellow police tape, with his hands folded inside the sleeves of his cassock, and he did not pray. He hadn't been able to pray in the last 40 minutes, since the call had come, "Father, come quickly, there's been a shooting, it's your brother," and the world had narrowed to the sound of his own footsteps on ancient stone. Marco Rizzo, born 1971, died on a Tuesday in November, in the square outside the church his younger brother served, as though making one final gesture of dominion even in death. "Father." Inspector Calabrese materialized at Antonio's elbow. He was a short man, with the compact, sorrowful bearing of someone who delivered bad news for a living. He had grown up 3 streets over from the Rizzo house. He had attended Marco's first communion. He held his hat in both hands now, turning it slowly, and his eyes wouldn't quite meet the priest's. "I'm very sorry," Calabrese said. "Tell me what happened." 3 shots, close range, a professional. A pause. "He was found at 11:42. We believe it happened sometime after midnight. He was out here alone? There was a woman with him. A witness says she ran." Calabrese glanced toward the far edge of the piazza, where the alley swallowed the light entirely. "We haven't found her." Antonio said nothing. He was looking at Marco's face, what was left of the expression it held, the last thing it had registered. Not fear. Marco Rizzo had never been afraid of anything in his life. What Antonio saw looked almost like surprise. "Even you didn't see this coming, brother." The thought arrived without malice, and was followed immediately by a hollow, grinding grief, so enormous he had to clench his jaw to contain it. Marco had been many things, violent things, terrible things, but he had also been the one who taught Antonio to ride a bicycle in the alley behind their mother's house. He had been the one who sat outside the hospital room the night their father had his stroke, and held Antonio's hand without shame or comment for 6 hours. He had been, in the complicated cartography of a boy who grew up poor in Palermo, the person who made Antonio feel safest. That person was on the cobblestones now, covered by a sheet that flapped in the November wind like something impatient to be gone. "The child," Antonio said. Calabrese blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Marco had a child, infant. There should be—" Antonio stopped. There was a complication here, a tangle he had never fully straightened, and this was not the moment to explain it to the inspector. "Was there anyone else at the scene?" "No." Calabrese studied him. "Should there have been?" Antonio turned from the body. The church rose behind him. Santo Filippo Neri, founded 1887, its facade salt-eaten and beautiful and vast, and the doors were open, spilling amber light down the steps. He had left a half-finished homily on the desk in the sacristy. He had been preparing for the Feast of the Assumption, thinking about the word dormition, the sleep of Mary before her ascent, and whether death could be understood as sleep, and whether that was comfort or evasion. He had an answer to that question now. "No," he said. "There shouldn't have been." He climbed the steps. He did not look back at his brother. He had 6 hours before dawn, and he needed to think. Inside, the church was cold and quiet, and smelled of stone and candle smoke and the faint sweetness of old flowers. Antonio walked down the nave with his eyes on the altar. The Christ hung above it in that familiar posture of open-handed anguish, and he tried to find inside himself the stillness that had once come easily. In the seminary, he had been known for it. Rizzo has a quality of stillness, his formation director had written. He is not untouched by the world, but he has learned not to be swept away. He sat in the first pew and put his face in his hands. He was 31 years old. He had been a priest for 3 years. Before that, he had spent 28 years being Marco's brother, which meant he had spent 28 years learning to navigate the gravity field of a man who operated entirely outside ordinary rules of consequence. Marco had run the Rizzo family's interests in Palermo since their father's incapacitation. Protection money, certain imports, certain arrangements with politicians who preferred not to examine their own arrangements too closely. He had never asked Antonio to participate. He had, in fact, made it explicit that the choice to enter the church was not only permitted, but encouraged. One righteous man in the family, Marco had said at Antonio's ordination dinner, raising a glass of wine that cost more than Antonio's monthly stipend. That's worth something. God is watching, and now he'll have to give us credit. Antonio had laughed. He had thought it was a joke. Now he wasn't sure what it had been. He heard the door. Not the front doors, the side entrance, the one that opened onto the alley behind the sacristy, the one that had no lock worth the name. He heard it open with the particular scrape that had needed fixing since spring, and then he heard footsteps, light, careful, the footsteps of someone trying not to make sound, and then he heard nothing, which was worse. Antonio raised his head. He turned. She was standing at the edge of the nave, in the shadow between 2 pillars, and she was covered in blood. Not her own, or not entirely. She was wearing a dark coat that had done its best to absorb it, but there was a streak along her jaw and a smear across the back of one hand, and she was holding something bundled against her chest, something that shifted and made a small sound, and Antonio was on his feet before he had made the decision to move. "Don't," she said. He stopped. They were 10 feet apart. He had not seen Sarah Voss in 4 years. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they believed they had buried, with a recognition that is partly grief and partly fury and partly something that has no clean name. "I need your help," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, the voice of someone managing themselves the way you manage a wound. "I know I have no right to ask. I know what I am, but there is nowhere else." She looked down at the thing in her arms. "He told me, if anything happened, I should come here. He said you would help." Antonio looked at what she was carrying. A child, 4, perhaps 5 months old, sleeping impossibly against the chaos of the woman's chest. "Marco said that?" Antonio said. "Yes." "Where is he?" Sarah's face did something complicated. A contraction, a flatness, a return to blankness that was itself an answer. "I know he's dead," Antonio said quietly. "I was just outside." "Then you know what's coming." She took 1 step forward. The amber candlelight found her face properly, and Antonio could see how exhausted she was, the depth of it, the skeletal pallor. And something else, a fullness around her jaw and throat, a heaviness in how she held herself. Antonio. It was the first time she'd used his name. I'm pregnant. The church was very silent. The Christ above the altar maintained his posture of open-handed anguish. Antonio Rizzo, who had a quality of stillness, stood very still. I know, he said, after a moment that contained several lifetimes. I know. She stared at him. How could you possibly— Because I know how to count, he said, and I know when. He did not ask her how it had happened, the blood, the night, the flight from the piazza. Those answers would come when they came, and pressing her now would accomplish nothing except eroding the narrow margin of trust that had brought her through the side door. What he did instead was practical, which was its own kind of mercy. He took her through the sacristy and down the short corridor to the rooms behind the church, 3 small chambers that had once housed visiting clergy and now housed, in their various corners, boxes of donated clothing, cots folded against the wall, a kettle, and a space heater that worked when the mood struck it. He set the space heater going, and it ticked and groaned, and eventually produced warmth. He found a towel and a clean shirt that had been donated and likely forgotten. He left them on the folding table without comment and stepped outside the door and waited. The child slept through all of it. This struck him as either miraculous or concerning, and he filed it under things to examine when there was time. He heard water running. He heard the particular sound of someone cleaning themselves in a hurry, efficient, joyless. He heard once a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite anything else, and he pressed his back against the wall and studied the ceiling and waited for it to pass. When she opened the door, she was wearing the donated shirt, a man's flannel, enormous on her, and she had done something to her hair to get it out of her face. The child was awake now, black-eyed and silent, regarding Antonio with the unsettling gravity of infants. His name is Luca, she said. She meant the child. Marco named him. How old? 4 months and 12 days. She said it with the precision of someone for whom that number had become load-bearing, a fact to hold on to when other facts dissolved. Antonio nodded. He gestured toward the cot. She sat on it without argument, which told him more about her exhaustion than anything she could have said. The child settled against her knee. Start at the beginning, he said. He pulled the single chair and sat across from her, forearms on his knees. Tell me what happened tonight. You first, she said. He blinked. You said you knew. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the low light. 4 years, and they were exactly as he remembered, direct, measuring, the eyes of someone who assessed threats for a living and had learned to extend that assessment to everything. About the pregnancy. You said you knew how to count. So before I tell you anything, I want to know what that means, what you think you know. Antonio was quiet for a moment. In the 3 years since his ordination, he had sat across from many people in rooms smaller than ordinary, in confessionals, in hospital waiting rooms, in the converted closets that parishes called counselling offices, and he had learned that there was a particular quality to the silence that preceded true confession. Not the performed silence of someone deciding what to reveal, but the real silence of someone deciding whether they could survive the telling. He recognized it now, because he was in it himself. "Before I was ordained," he said, "there was a night. You know which one." He didn't look away from her. "After Marco's associates' dinner in Catania. You were there in a professional capacity, I understood. You weren't what I had expected." He paused. "We spoke for 3 hours. We walked along the harbour. At 2 in the morning you said something about the water that I've never forgotten. And I don't think I was entirely in my own right mind. And neither were you." He stopped. "And then morning came, and you were gone, and I went to the seminary, and 6 weeks later I was ordained, and I had—" He pressed his hands together. "I had made my choices, and I thought you had made yours." The silence in the room was very specific now. "You never told Marco," she said. "It wasn't his to know. He would have—" She stopped. "It would have complicated things." "Yes." She looked down at Luca, who was investigating the hem of her shirt with the focused intensity of someone conducting research. "It was one night," she said. "Yes." "You became a priest." "Yes." "And now—" She lifted her eyes to him. There was no softness in them, but there was something rawer than softness, something that had not been armoured yet, because it had no armour to put on. "Now what?" Antonio had been asking himself that question for the last 20 minutes with escalating desperation. He was a priest. He had taken vows. He believed in those vows with the same thoroughness with which he believed in anything: the creed, the sacraments, the fundamental ordering principle of sacrifice. He had not come to the church as an escape from anything, which was what people assumed. He had come to it because at 25, standing on a hillside outside Palermo, watching the sun go down over the sea, he had felt with absolute clarity that the world required more love than it was getting, and that he had been given the specific capacity to contribute to that. He still believed that. He believed it in the same way he believed in gravity, not as a preference, but as a fact he lived inside. He also believed, sitting in this small, cold room, that the woman across from him was carrying his child, and that his brother was dead on cobblestones outside, and that men with guns were looking for her, and that whatever came next needed to be navigated with extreme care. "For now," he said, "you're safe here, both of you." He looked at Luca, then back at her. "The Church has canonical sanctuary protections that are mostly theoretical in the modern legal context, but practically speaking, no one is going to walk into a church with guns. Not in this town. Not even Marco's enemies had that kind of impiety." "Don't be certain of that," she said. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "Sarah." "The Casada family," she said. "Nico Casada." She watched his face. "You know that name." Everyone in Sicily knows that name. Marco was moving against them. He had been for 18 months, quietly, building alliances, positioning. She stopped, compressed, restarted. "I was part of that. I worked for Marco, with Marco. You understand what that means?" "I understand. I know things. I have documents. I have—" She glanced at the sleeping Luca, a flicker of something intensely private crossing her face. "I'm not some bystander, Antonio. I'm a liability. If Casara's men find me, they don't take prisoners." "Then they won't find you." She looked at him steadily. You're a priest in a poor parish in Palermo with no security and no weapons and no way to— I know what I am, he said. His voice was quiet, and it was very level, and something in the levelness of it made her stop. I've always known what I am. My brother spent 15 years trying to tell me it wasn't enough. He was wrong. He stood. I'm going to make you something to eat. You're going to sleep. In the morning, we'll figure out the next step. She stared at him. That's it, she said. That's your plan? That's the first part of it. We're talking about Nico Cassara, Antonio. We're talking about— I know. He moved to the door. Tea or coffee? A pause. It stretched. Coffee, she said, and something in the way she said it, flat, exhausted, not quite disbelieving, told him that the decision had been made, even if neither of them could have said exactly what decision it was. He went to make coffee, and behind him the child made a sound of contentment, and outside the church his brother's body lay cooling on the cobblestones, and the night was very long. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk in the sacristy until 4 in the morning, with a legal pad in front of him and his hand wrapped around a pen and nothing on the paper. And then he set the pen down and looked at the crucifix above the desk, small, tarnished, his mother's, and had the most difficult conversation with God he'd had since seminary. It was not a spoken conversation. Antonio's prayer had never been spoken in private. It was interior, a continuous, low-frequency dialogue with a presence he recognized the way you recognized a voice you'd known since childhood. He had argued with that presence before, over Marcus's choices, over the limits of forgiveness, over the theological questions that kept him awake even in peaceful times. But he had not argued like this. You knew, he said, to the silence. You knew all of it, and you put her on the other side of that door. The silence gave no answer, which was itself a kind of answer. He thought about Sarah Voss. He had thought about her for 4 years, with a discipline that had cost him considerably. The deliberate, methodical not-thinking of someone who understands that certain thoughts are fires, and that fires, if not managed, consume everything. In the months after Catania, when he was still in formation and the seminary's routine had been both sanctuary and crucible, he had gone to confession 3 times about that night. His confessor, Father Benedetto, 70 years old, unshockable, had listened each time without commentary, and had assigned him the same penance on each occasion, the Magnificat, 3 times, slowly. My soul magnifies the Lord. He had said it 9 times in total, kneeling on the stone floor of the seminary chapel at midnight, and by the 9th time he had understood it differently than the first, not as triumph, but as surrender, as the recognition that the self that wants things is not the self that is asked to serve. He had made peace with it. He had believed he had made peace with it. Now she was sleeping 20 feet away, in his church, in his flannel shirt, carrying his child. He picked up the pen. He wrote, "What must be done?" Beneath it, "Keep her safe. Keep Luca safe." Beneath that, after a pause, "Contact Don Ferrante." He looked at that 3rd item. Don Ferrante was 72, retired from everything official, still the most respected figure in Palermo's ecclesiastical and criminal architecture. A man who existed in the narrow Venn diagram where the church and the families had long coexisted, not because they shared values, but because they shared geography. He had been Marco's godfather. He had attended Antonio's ordination and given him a Bible that had belonged to Ferrante's own late son, a priest who had died young. If anyone could negotiate a temporary ceasefire in whatever war had just lost its general, it was Ferrante. But Ferrante is old, Antonio thought, and Cassara is new money, new methods. He doesn't respect the old courtesies. He put the pen down again. At 5:15 he heard the child. It was not urgent crying. It was the tentative testing sound of an infant unsure whether the world was worth full noise, and it was followed quickly by Sarah's voice, low and soothing, and then quiet. Antonio sat with his hands folded and listened to the sound of a woman talking to an infant in the middle of the night, and felt the weight of his vows settle onto him like stone. He had never thought of his vows as a weight before. That was the point. They were supposed to be a structure, a freedom, the scaffold that let you climb higher than you could alone. His brother had called them a cage, but Marco had called any constraint a cage, which was why he'd spent his life inside a different and more literal one. What Antonio felt now was not the structure failing. It was the structure meeting something that the structure had not been designed to accommodate, and the friction was immense. He rose at 5:30 and went to the small chapel to say matins. He said the office from memory, which he always did, but the words came from a different depth than usual, not the surface-level fluency of habit, but something that had to be dragged up from where it lived, in whatever part of him remained certain when the rest was confusion. Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. He stood at the altar in the grey pre-dawn, and he declared. She found him in the sacristy at 7, when he was reviewing the day's schedule. A funeral at 10, nothing else until evening mass. She was wearing her own clothes again, dried and mostly presentable, and she was carrying Luca in a way that was practiced and unself-conscious. She had done something to her hair. She looked, in the morning light, exactly like herself, which was to say, striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the quality of her attention. Sarah Voss did not look at anything softly. She had a gaze that took measurements. It was on him now. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No, neither did I." She looked around the sacristy, the vestments hanging in their careful order, the silver of the chalice catching light, the crucifix. "Did you think about what happens next?" "Yes." "And?" He told her about Ferrante. He watched her face as he spoke, the careful neutrality of it, the particular stillness of someone assessing whether a plan is feasible or suicidal. "Ferrante hasn't been active for years," she said when he finished. "He doesn't need to be active. He needs to make a phone call." "And you think he'll make that call for you?" "I think he'll make it for Marco." Antonio paused. "And I think he'll make it because he has some remaining interest in order, and what happened last night is disorder." Sarah looked at Luca, who was studying Antonio with the unnerving directness of infants. Cassara's men came to Marco's apartment 2 hours before the shooting. I was there. I got out with Luca and... She stopped. There were 4 of them. They weren't there to negotiate. "Were you followed to the church?" "No. I went 3 blocks out of my way. I know how to lose a tail." She said it without arrogance, simply as information. "But they know Marco had a son. They know about Luca. A child can be leverage. Not in a church." "Antonio." There was a patience in her voice that wasn't patience at all. It was the controlled frustration of someone who had operated in rooms where naivety was fatal. You keep saying that. In a church. As though Nico Cassara has ever in his life been deterred by a building. It's not the building, he said. It's what the building represents. Even men like Cassara understand that killing a priest, or killing anyone under a priest's protection, is a different kind of war than they want to fight. It brings attention, federal attention, Vatican attention. He met her gaze. I'm not being naive. I'm describing a political reality. She looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this kind of thing before, she said. It was not a question. I grew up in this world, he said. I left it. That doesn't mean I stopped understanding it. Something shifted in her face, fractional, almost invisible, but he caught it. A reassessment. I need to tell you some things, she said, about Marco, about what he was doing and why Cassara wants me specifically. She sat down in the chair opposite him, shifted Luca to her lap. There are things you won't want to hear. Tell me anyway. She did. It took 45 minutes. Antonio listened without interrupting, which was a skill he had trained over 3 years of hearing confessions, the practiced reception of what someone chose to give you without the intrusion of your own reactions. He managed it for perhaps 30 of those 45 minutes, and then Sarah told him about a specific event in Naples 18 months ago, and he had to stand and face the window for a moment. Not because of what she had done. He had known, in an abstract way, what she was, what Marco employed, but hearing it in her voice, level, factual, without apology or drama, made it concrete in a way that the abstraction had never been. He turned back. Are you telling me this because you want absolution? She blinked. No? Then why? She looked at him with those measuring eyes. Because you need to know what you're protecting, she said. If you're going to do this, if you're going to keep me here and call Ferrante and fight Nico Cassara on my behalf, you need to know exactly what I am. You don't get to be surprised by me later. Antonio sat back down. I know what you are, he said quietly. You know what you thought I was. No. He held her gaze. I know what you are. I've known since Catania, when we stood at the harbour at 2 a.m, and you told me you'd never in your life been able to see the sea without thinking about all the things it could swallow. He paused. You weren't talking about ships. Sarah was very still. I am not here to judge you, he said. I am not able to judge you and do this at the same time. What I can do is help you. He glanced at Luca. Help you both. Help all 3 of you. A silence. You keep saying you, she said, when you talk about the child. I know. You haven't said it. No. She looked at him. He looked back. Say it, she said. The child is mine, he said. Our child. That's what I believe. And until you tell me otherwise, that's what I know. She didn't confirm it, and she didn't deny it, and after a moment she looked down at the child in her lap, and whatever was happening in her face was private enough that Antonio looked away. Outside, the city was waking up, and somewhere in its narrow streets, men with guns were looking for her, and a priest who had a quality of stillness was discovering that stillness has limits. The house on Via dei Gelsomini smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, and the particular atmosphere of accumulated authority, that specific pressure in the air that exists in rooms where important things have been decided over the course of decades. Antonio had been here twice before, once when he was 7, when Marco had brought him along to a meeting he hadn't been told was a meeting. Once at 20, when he'd been introduced formally, which was another kind of meeting entirely. Both times he had sat in the reception room. He had never been brought to the study. Don Ferrante brought him now. He was a large man who had once been larger. Age had reduced him from the towering physical presence of his middle years, but what remained was substantial, and what remained of the eyes above the heavy jowls was very sharp indeed. He wore a dark cardigan and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the general impression of a retired schoolteacher, which Antonio knew was calculated. "Sit," Ferrante said. Antonio sat. The room was lined with books, real ones, annotated ones, with markers and cracked spines. He noticed a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions on the corner of the desk, and felt, despite everything, a moment of strange kinship. "Your brother," Ferrante said. He sat behind the desk. He did not offer condolences in words. Instead, he folded his hands and looked at Antonio with an expression that contained, Antonio thought, genuine sorrow. A terrible thing, yes. You were close. As close as we could be, given the differences. He was proud of you. Ferrante picked up a letter opener and turned it in his hands. Not threatening, just restless, the fidgeting of a man whose body had outlasted its need to be still. He told me once, at dinner 2 years ago, that you were the only good thing the Rizzo family had ever produced. He said it like a joke, but he meant it. Marco always meant the serious things like jokes. Antonio absorbed this. I need your help, Don Ferrante. I imagined you didn't come for tea. The woman, Sera Vos, she's in my church. Ferrante's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something moved behind the eyes. Is she? She came to me last night. She has Luca, Marco's son, and she is... He paused. He had decided on the drive over, in the rain, how much to say. She is under my protection. I'm asking you to intercede with Cassara. Intercede? Ferrante set down the letter opener. That's a very ecclesiastical word for what you're asking, Father. It's what I'm asking. Nico Cassara is not interested in intercession. He is interested in consolidation. Your brother spent 18 months building something that he intended to use against the Cassara interests. Alliances, information, leverage. Now Marco is dead. The structure is headless, and Cassara will move to absorb what remains. Ferrante looked at him steadily. The woman is not just a loose end. She is a vault. Whatever Marco had, documents, testimony, financial information, she almost certainly knows where it is. Possibly carries some of it. She does, Antonio confirmed. Ferrante nodded slowly. Then you understand why Cassara will not be deterred by... She's pregnant, Antonio said it simply, as a fact. She has an infant. She's in a church. I'm asking you to buy time, a week, 2 weeks, enough to move her somewhere safer. He held the older man's gaze. You were Marco's godfather. You owe him something. I owed Marco many things, and paid most of them while he was alive. But Ferrante was quiet after he said it, looking at the desk, at the letter opener, at something past both. You're his brother, a priest. You've come to me personally, which Marco never did. Marco sent representatives. You came yourself, which is either courage or naivety, and I'm not sure which. Both, probably. Something moved in Ferrante's face that might have been a suppressed smile. Your brother said you were honest. To a fault, apparently. Sit with me, Ferrante said. I'll have Julia bring coffee, and you'll tell me what Sarah Voss has and where she plans to go with it, because before I call anyone about anything, I need to understand what I'm negotiating with. Antonio sat. The coffee came, strong, dark, served in cups so small they were almost accusatory. He told Ferrante what Sarah had told him, which was not everything, but was the relevant architecture. Ferrante listened, with his eyes half closed and his hands folded, and when Antonio finished, he opened his eyes and refilled both cups without asking. There is a man in Naples, Ferrante said, a lawyer named Esposito. He works for a consortium that would be very interested in the documents your brother compiled, the kind of interest that comes with resources, legal resources, protection resources. He paused. If the woman can get to Naples with what she has, Esposito can build a structure around her that Cassara cannot reach without dismantling himself. How long would that take to arrange? If she's willing, 3 days. If she has what she says she has, Esposito will move quickly. Ferrante looked at him across the small cups of coffee. Can she travel? She's pregnant. Perhaps 6 months. She can travel. The child? Luca? He goes with her. Ferrante nodded. Then I'll make the call to Esposito, and He weighed something. I'll reach out to Cassara's people. I won't call it a negotiation. I'll call it a courtesy, informing them that the woman is under church protection, and that any action against the church will attract the kind of attention that benefits no one. He set down his cup. This buys you 72 hours, perhaps 90. After that, I cannot guarantee. 72 hours, Antonio said. Use them well, Father. Antonio stood. He was at the door when Ferrante spoke again. She's carrying your child. It was not a question. Antonio did not turn around. Yes, he said. Marco knew? No. A pause. He would have complicated things, knowing that. Yes. He is gone now, Ferrante said, so the complication is yours. Another pause. What will you do? Antonio looked at the hallway beyond the door, the dark wood panelling, the photographs, the long gallery of accumulated consequence that lined this house. I don't know yet, he said. That, said Ferrante, with something that was almost kindness, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. The 3 days that followed had a specific texture that Antonio would remember for the rest of his life, a compression, a heightening, as though ordinary time had been replaced by something denser. He conducted the funeral at 10 on the first morning. It was for an elderly woman from the parish, Signora Brucato, 91, survived by 4 children and 11 grandchildren, and he stood at the graveside in the November cold and spoke about the light of God's face and the deep mercy of sleep, and his voice was entirely steady. Across the cemetery, two men in dark coats stood near the gate and watched the service with the patient inattention of surveillance. He noted them. He did not react. After the burial, he went to the church hall and spoke to old Salvatore, who managed the physical maintenance of the building, and asked no questions Antonio did not want asked. He arranged for the door on the west side, the one opposite the visible street, to be kept unlocked. He arranged for food, quietly, from the market 2 streets over, carried in on the pretext of stocking the pantry for the parish's weekly meal service. He arranged, through a chain of phone calls that kept his voice casual and his phrasing general, for a contact in Messina to have a car available. Sarah did not leave the rooms behind the sacristy. She had her phone, turned off, the battery removed, which she'd done herself without being asked, which told him something about her training. She had Luca. She had the items from her coat pockets, which included a flash drive, a folded document in a waterproof sleeve, and a small, semi-automatic pistol that she placed on the folding table between them on the second day, with the matter-of-fact calm of someone laying down their keys. Antonio looked at the gun. "I'm not going to ask you not to have it," he said. "Good," she said, "but I'd prefer it stays off the altar." She looked at him. Then, impossibly, something crossed her face that was almost amusement. It was there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Agreed," she said. They ate together, the 3 of them, in the small room. Antonio fed Luca twice. The infant accepted him with the magnificent indifference of very young children who allocate trust based on warmth and consistency rather than biography. He held Luca with more care than he'd held anything in years, this small, serious person who looked, in certain lights, startlingly like Antonio's own brother had looked in photographs from early childhood. He didn't say this to Sarah. She watched him with Luca in a way that she thought he didn't notice. He noticed. On the second evening, they sat on opposite ends of the cot with Luca between them, and she told him things. Not case information, not the documents, not the Cassara intelligence. Things about herself. Antonio did not ask for them. He simply did not fill the silence, and she filled it instead, and he thought this was perhaps the most important pastoral skill he had, this ability to create a space that was safe enough for a person to enter. She told him she'd been born in Frankfurt to a German father and a Sicilian mother who had returned to Palermo when Sarah was 4 after the father's death. She told him she'd been recruited at 22 by men who had identified her in the aftermath of a violent incident she described with clinical brevity. A situation she had handled, she said, in a way that demonstrated applicable skills. She said she'd been with Marco's organization for 6 years. She said she'd been good at what she did, and she said it without pride or apology, simply as inventory. "Did you ever want to leave?" Antonio asked. "I left every night," she said. "In my head, I had 100 plans for where I'd go." She looked at the wall. None of them included this. None of mine did either. She turned to look at him. In the low light, in the small room, with the child between them breathing with the small, industrious rhythm of sleep, there was a proximity that had nothing to do with physical distance. "Do you think about that night?" she asked. It was direct, no lead-in, no preamble. She asked the way she did everything, without armor. "Yes," he said. "Often?" "Often enough that I had to confess it." A pause. "What did your confessor say?" "He assigned me the Magnificat." 3 times? 9. She was quiet. Then, "Did it help?" Antonio considered this with the same honesty with which he tried to consider all things. "It helped me understand what I'd chosen," he said, "which isn't the same as not thinking about it." "What had you chosen?" "To give up the things I wanted," he said, "for the thing I believed I was for." She was very still. "And what are you for?" she asked. He thought about it. He looked at the sleeping child. "I used to be able to answer that quickly," he said. She didn't respond. She lay back slowly on the cot, careful of Luca, and looked at the ceiling, and after a while her breathing slowed and she slept. Antonio remained sitting, watching them both, the woman and the child, and outside the November rain came down on the old stones of Palermo, and somewhere in the city men were looking for her, and somewhere God was doing something that Antonio was not yet equipped to interpret. He prayed, not the Magnificat, something older. "Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy." On the second night, the men came. Not with guns, not directly, not yet. They came with a kind of polite menace that was, in its way, more threatening. Two of them, well dressed, arriving at the front of the church at 9 in the evening, when Antonio was locking up after evening mass. One showed a business card, a consulting firm, a name that meant nothing on the card, and everything in context. Antonio stood in the doorway of the church, his door, and held the card. "We're looking for someone," the first man said. He was perhaps 40, Roman accent, the kind of face that had been specifically arranged to communicate nothing. "A woman. We believe she may have sought assistance in this neighborhood." "Many people seek assistance in this neighborhood," Antonio said. "That's what the church is for." "Of course, Father." A practiced pause. "This particular woman, Sarah Voss, is involved in an ongoing legal matter. Her associates are very concerned for her welfare." "Her welfare?" "Yes." Antonio looked at the man. He looked at the card. He looked at the man again. "If you're concerned for someone's welfare," he said, "the appropriate course of action is to contact the police." He handed the card back. "Which I'd be happy to assist you do from right here." A silence. The second man, younger, larger, with the specific stillness of someone trained to keep the violence contained, looked at Antonio with an attention that wanted to communicate something. Antonio looked back without expression. "If you hear anything," the first man said, "we would greatly appreciate—" "Good evening," Antonio said, and closed the door. He stood inside with his back against it for 30 seconds. Then he moved. He went through the nave at a pace that was not quite running, priests did not run in the nave, and through the sacristy and down the corridor, and knocked once on the door. "They're at the front," he said. She opened the door immediately. She was already dressed, coat on, Luca in one arm, the other hand at her hip where the gun would be. Her face was absolutely blank. "How many?" "Two, well-dressed, presenting a legal cover story." He kept his voice low. "They'll circle the building." "I know." She stepped past him into the corridor, looked both directions with a quick, practiced scan. "The west door." "Yes, but not tonight. They'll have someone on every exit within 10 minutes. We need to wait them out." She looked at him. "They know I'm here." "They suspect. There's a difference." "Not in my world." "Then use my world's logic for the next 12 hours. He met her eyes. No one storms a church at night in Palermo. They'll watch the exits. When nothing comes out, they'll pull back and reassess. That gives us mourning, which is what we need. And if they don't pull back? Then we adapt. She stared at him for a moment with that measuring gaze, and he could see her running calculations, probabilities, variables, the geometry of escape and containment. And then something in her face settled, not into trust exactly, but into something adjacent to it. Pragmatic acceptance. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They went back into the room and waited. The waiting was its own kind of test. Antonio had experienced waiting in extremity before, the long night at his father's bedside, the vigil before ordination, the hours after a parishioner's suicide, when the family's grief had required simply the fact of his presence. He knew how to be still in time that wanted to move. Sarah knew a different kind of stillness, operational stillness, alert, coiled, never passive. She sat in the corner of the cot with Luca across her knees, and she watched the door and the window and the door and the window, and her right hand was never far from the gun, and Antonio found himself watching her in a way he tried to make professional and wasn't. She was extraordinary. That was the plain fact of it, and he was not going to improve his situation by avoiding plain facts. She had a quality of total presence, complete attention deployed entirely in the direction of what required it. He had known people like that occasionally. They tended to be either very holy or very dangerous. She was not holy. She was, he searched for the word, vital. In the original sense, the thing that is alive in a way that makes its aliveness apparent. "Stop looking at me," she said, without moving her eyes from the door. "I apologize." "No, you don't." A pause. "No," he agreed. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "You're a terrible priest," she said. "I'm an excellent priest," he said. "I'm a terrible monk." She did look at him then. The thing at her mouth had become something more definite, not quite a smile, but the clear ancestor of one. "There's a difference?" "Considerable," he said. "A monk removes himself from the world. A priest stays inside it." "And what happens when the world comes and sits on your cot?" He looked at her face, at the extraordinary particularity of her, the strong line of her jaw, the dark depth of her eyes, the pregnancy that was just now becoming visible as a fullness, a gravity, a fact that both of them were perpetually not discussing. "Then you stay inside the world," he said, "and you figure out what honouring your vows looks like when the world is more complicated than you planned." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I'm not going to ask you to break your vows," she said. "I know." "I'm not going to." She stopped, started again. "Whatever this is, I'm not trying to make it something that destroys you." "I know that too." "Do you?" "You told me what you were before you asked me for anything," he said. "You gave me the information to say no. That's not the behaviour of someone trying to manipulate." She was quiet. "I didn't think about it that way," she said. "I did." Outside, very faintly, he could hear the men moving, the occasional sound of a footstep in the alley, the ghost of a murmur. Watching the doors, waiting for movement. Antonio sat with his back against the wall and his hands in his lap and watched Sarah watch the door, and the night moved over them both like water. By dawn, the men were gone. Antonio knew this, the way he knew other things about enclosed spaces, by a change in the quality of the silence, a subtraction of presence. He had been awake all night. He had watched the light change in the strip above the window, from black to grey to the particular pale gold of Sicilian November mornings, and when the gold arrived, he stood and stretched and went quietly into the corridor to check the exits. All clear. He came back and found Sarah awake. She had been awake for hours, he suspected, and told her. Ferrante said 72 hours, she said. She was nursing Luca with the practiced efficiency of someone who had reached a rapprochement with necessity. We have maybe 30 hours left. The car is arranged. Messina, then a private ferry. He had worked it out the previous afternoon. You'd be in Naples by tomorrow evening. And Esposito. Ferrante confirmed he's expecting you. She nodded. Her face was calm, the operational blankness that he was learning to read differently now, to see not as coldness, but as a coping mechanism, a way of keeping function when feeling would interfere with survival. The documents, he said. The flash drive. You're certain Esposito can use them? The financial trail alone would be enough to convene a parliamentary inquiry. There's also testimony, recorded testimony from 3 people who are now dead, but the recordings exist. She shifted Luca. Marco was thorough. Whatever else he was thorough. He was, Antonio agreed. A pause settled between them, with the comfortable weight of something that had stopped pretending to be comfortable. After Naples, Antonio said, what happens to you? She looked at him. I don't know, she said. Protective custody, possibly. Esposito will want me available for whatever process happens. I won't be able to move freely for a while. She looked at Luca. It's not a bad arrangement for him. Stability, safety. And the other child? She was quiet. I don't know, she said again, but this time it carried more weight. The not knowing of someone who has been very deliberately not looking at a specific door in a specific wall, because opening it requires more courage than she currently has. Antonio took a breath. He had been thinking about how to say this for 48 hours and had not arrived at anything graceful, which meant he would simply say it plainly. I'm going to come to Naples, he said. She looked up sharply. I need to speak to my bishop, he continued. There are arrangements that can be made. There are priests who have come before tribunals, who have requested dispensations, who have taken leaves of absence. Antonio, for legitimate pastoral reasons. Antonio. Her voice was very quiet. Stop. He stopped. Don't do this for me, she said. Don't dismantle your life for I'm not doing it for you. He met her eyes. I'm doing it because you're carrying a child I fathered before I took my vows, and that child is going to come into the world, and whatever my vows require of me, they don't require me to be absent from my own child's life. They're not supposed to require that. He paused. And I want... He stopped. Started again. I need to say this carefully. Say it however you need to say it. I have been in love with you, he said, in the specific way that one is in love with someone one has decided one cannot have, which is the worst way, which is the way that doesn't go away because it never gets to complete itself. For 4 years. He kept his voice level. I am not telling you that so that you will feel obligated to respond to it. I am telling you because you asked me on the second night to say what was true. Sarah was very still. Luca made a satisfied sound. You're a priest, she said. Yes. Who is in love with me? Who loves you, he said. The in love part I'm not sure what to do with yet, but the fact of it is there. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the light through the window shifted. I don't know how to... She stopped. I'm not equipped for this. Neither am I. I've never... Another stop. The people in my life have either wanted to use me or wanted to own me. I don't know what this is. Neither do I, he said for the second time. I'm a priest who grew up in a Mafia family and is currently hiding a former assassin in his sacristy and appears to have fathered a child in a single night 4 years ago. My map for this situation has significant gaps. Something broke in her face then, not in a bad way. It broke the way ice breaks in spring, which is destruction in the service of movement. She laughed. It was brief, surprised out of her, a single short sound, but it was real, and it transformed her face entirely, and Antonio thought, there it is. The person under the armour. The person he had spoken to for 3 hours by the harbour in Catania, who had told him about the sea. You're ridiculous, she said. Possibly, he said, but I'm also not wrong. She was still smiling. The first smile he had seen from her, he realised, in 4 years, and it did something to his chest that he was not going to examine in detail at this moment. Naples, she said. Yes. Come to Naples, she said. It was not quite an invitation and not quite a concession. It was a door being opened by someone who was not certain what was on the other side, which was, he thought, the best kind of door. Yes, he said. The car came at 4 in the morning on the 3rd day. It was an unremarkable Fiat, grey, middle-aged, the perfect camouflage of the Italian road, and it arrived at the West Alley exit with its lights off, driven by a man Antonio knew by first name only, Enzo. Mid-50s, a former associate of a former associate, the kind of connection that exists in all Sicilian lives, whether they want it or not. A knot in the family tree from a generation back. Antonio had already been awake for 2 hours. He had said the office, dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a dark jacket, collar off, and had gone over the route twice, and then a 3rd time, and when it was time, he went to the rooms behind the sacristy and knocked. She was ready. She was always ready, he was learning. It was not a quality of anticipation, not anxiety, not vigilance in the way that suggested fear. It was simply that she processed the world at a speed that meant she was rarely caught behind it. She was ready before a situation became urgent, which was why she was still alive. She handed him the baby. He took Luca with the confidence of someone who has fed an infant 3 times in the last 3 days and knows how the weight distributes. Luca looked up at him in the dark, with the absolute composure of a being for whom this is all entirely normal. You're going to be a person, Antonio thought, looking at the child. An entire, particular person, with all that implies. And I had something to do with that, and I am entirely unprepared. They moved through the church quickly and quietly, Antonio leading, Sarah behind with the bag, Luca between them in a carrier she had improvised from a scarf. The church at 4 in the morning was a specific place. The candlelight perpetual at the altar, the shadows massive and steady, the silence that was not empty but inhabited. He had been in this church at every hour of the day, and he loved it at all of them, but especially at this hour, when it was most purely itself. He paused at the base of the altar. She came up beside him. She was looking at the Christ, the same posture, the same open hands, the same expression that he found inexhaustibly complex. "Does it help?" she asked. Quiet, genuine. "Yes," he said. "Not in the way people expect. It's not comfort, exactly. It's more like company." Company. Yes, like someone else has been here before, in the specific kind of darkness that this is. He looked up at the face. Someone who also didn't get to choose between the things he loved and the things he was required to do. She was quiet beside him. "That's a very particular way to read it," she said. "I've had 3 years to read it." They stood for a moment more, the priest, the former assassin, the infant, in the amber light of the perpetual candle. And then Antonio turned and led them to the west door and out into the dark. The drive to Messina took 3 hours. Enzo drove. Antonio sat in back with Sarah, Luca asleep across both their laps, in the way infants collapse across whatever is available. Outside the windows, the island moved past in the dark. Hillsides, olive trees, the occasional cluster of lights. And Antonio watched Sicily leaving him and felt what the church had prepared him to feel about departure. A clean grief, the kind that knows what it is. "Tell me something," Sarah said, after the first hour of silence. "What?" "Anything. About before." She was looking out the window. "Before the church. Before Marco got... Before all this." He thought. "I wanted to be a painter," he said. "When I was 12. I spent a whole summer painting the view from our roof. Water and the harbour and the fishing boats. I gave them all to my mother, and she put them in the hall." "Are you any good?" "Terrible. My mother was lying every time she said otherwise." He paused. "But I loved doing it. The specific attention of it, the looking, standing in one place for a long time and looking very carefully at the same thing." She turned from the window. "That's what you do now." "Differently." "Not so differently," she said. He considered this. She was right, in the way that outside observations about oneself often are, arriving at the truth by an angle you can't access from inside. "What about you?" he said. "Before." "Before is a long way back. Take your time." She looked at the dark road. "I used to draw maps," she said, "when I was small. I would make up places, cities, coastlines, and draw their maps in this enormous detail. Roads and neighbourhoods, and little symbols for things I invented. Libraries, theatres." A pause. "My mother said I had a very organised inner world for someone who never sat still." "Where are those maps now?" "Gone." She said it simply, without drama. "Everything from before is gone." "Not everything," he said. "You're still someone who creates detailed structure out of complexity. You just do it with exits and contingencies instead of roads and theatres." She looked at him sidelong. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to be accurate." She was quiet. "My mother," she said. "She died when I was 18, before any of this. She was the only person who ever knew me uncomplicated." She said it the way she said all the difficult things, plainly, without performance. I think about what she would think if she could see me now, and it's not something I can sit with for long. Antonio thought about his own mother, Rosaria Rizzo, who had made pasta every Sunday, regardless of what her sons had become, who had kept the paintings of the harbour in the hall, who had wept at his ordination with a specific combination of joy and grief he had never fully decoded. "My mother knew what Marco was," he said. "She knew it for 20 years. She still made Sunday pasta. She still—" He paused. "She told me once that you can't love someone and pretend you don't see them. You have to see them completely and love what's there." Sarah was very still. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. It came out with more certainty than he expected. "She would have been terrified of you initially, and then she would have made you sit down and fed you until you looked less like you were surviving." Something caught in Sarah's throat. She turned back to the window very quickly. He did not push. He looked at the road, at the dark of the island sliding past, at the first distant shimmer of the Strait of Messina appearing ahead, and he let her have the silence. An hour later, Luca woke and cried, and they both reached for him simultaneously, and their hands met over the child's small body, and neither of them moved away immediately. The ferry crossing was 40 minutes. They stood at the bow in the cold. Enzo had stayed with the car on the vehicle deck, and the water was black and metallic under the ferry's lights, and the wind came off it salt-bitter and steady. Luca was asleep again, bundled against Antonio's chest in the carrier, unreasonably serene. The mainland was visible ahead as a smear of lights climbing the Calabrian hills. Antonio had crossed this water many times, the first time as a boy with Marco on a trip their father had arranged to Naples that had been explained as a family visit and was probably something else entirely. He had stood at this same railing, or one like it, and Marco had been 21 and had put his arm around Antonio's shoulders and pointed at the mainland and said, "That's the rest of the world, little brother. Don't be impressed. It's just more of the same." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "About my brother." She was quiet. "You knew him well," Antonio said. It was not quite a question. "Well enough." She leaned on the railing, looking at the water. "Marco was... he was not an easy person. He could be kind, in his way. He was capable of genuine warmth, but he also understood people primarily as things that could be useful or dangerous, and that understanding coloured everything." She paused. "He was good to me, protective. I think he cared, in the specific way he was capable of caring." She glanced at Antonio. "He never told me about you." "Not directly. He mentioned a brother who was a priest, but he spoke of it like a closed topic, something settled, something that didn't connect to anything else." "He was ashamed," Antonio said. "Not of you. No. Ashamed to have a brother who chose something he couldn't control." He watched the water. "Marco understood love as ownership. He loved things by keeping them close and managing them. I was the only person in his life he couldn't manage." A pause. "I think it disturbed him, and I think he was prouder of me for it than he could ever say. He told Ferrante you were the only good thing. He told Ferrante when I wasn't there to hear it." He smiled slightly. "That was Marco exactly. The truth could only travel when he wasn't in the room." She looked at him. "You're grieving him," she said. "Yes. Even knowing what he was?" "Especially knowing what he was. Because knowing what someone is doesn't change what they were to you. Those are two different truths, and they can both be true at once." He adjusted Luca slightly, feeling the small, warm weight settle. That's one of the things I believe as a priest, that a person is more than the worst thing they've done, and also that the worst things they've done are real and have real consequences. Both are true. She was quiet for a long moment. That must be very difficult, she said, to hold both. It is. Does it? She stopped, started differently. When you hear confessions, when someone tells you what they've done, is there a point where the both at once breaks? Where it's just this person, what they did? He thought about it honestly. I've been close, he said. There was a man in my first parish who confessed something. I can't say what, but it was about children. And I sat in the confessional, and I said the words, and I assigned the penance, and inside I was... He stopped. The grace wasn't mine to give or withhold. I said the words anyway. I asked God to do with them what I couldn't. You don't think I need absolution, she said. It was careful, not a challenge, an inquiry. I think you'll need to find your own account with God eventually, he said. That's not something I can engineer for you. But no, I don't think you're damned. I think you're a person who made choices inside constraints that most people can't imagine, and whatever those choices cost you, they'll be weighed by someone more qualified than me. She looked at the water for a long time. I've killed people, she said, specifically, deliberately. I made plans and executed them, and people are dead. I know. You can still say, I love you, and know that. I said I loved you. I know that. He turned to look at her. The sea doesn't change its nature depending on what it's swallowed. She stared at him. That's what you said, he said, in Catania, by the harbour, at 2 a.m. She was very still. I said that, she confirmed, slowly. You were talking about memory, he said, about things you'd seen that you couldn't unsee. You said you loved the sea because it was the same sea, regardless of its history. He looked at the black water below them. I've thought about that many times. It seemed like the most accurate thing anyone had said to me about the nature of love. She pressed her hands against the railing. Her knuckles were white. I didn't know you were listening that closely, she said. I've always listened closely to you. The mainland grew larger ahead of them. The ferry's engine altered pitch, preparing to slow. Somewhere in its belly, Enzo sat in the grey Fiat, listening to radio static. Sarah turned from the water. She looked at Antonio with an expression he could not fully read, something between wonder and exhaustion and the particular terror of wanting something you haven't allowed yourself to want. She reached out and touched Luca's sleeping head. Her hand was millimeters from Antonio's chest. She left it there. He didn't move. They stood at the bow while Italy came to meet them, and the water went past beneath, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them had to. The city received them indifferently, as Naples receives everything, with noise and grandeur and zero regard for the significance of your arrival. Esposito's office was in the Chiaia district, on a street where the buildings were bone white and the geraniums blazed in window boxes even in November, and the building's exterior gave no indication of what went on inside. Second floor, waiting room in greige and chrome, the kind of neutrality that announces serious professional capacity. A woman at a desk who took their names without reaction and indicated chairs. Antonio had changed back into his collar on the ferry. He wasn't sure why exactly. It was partly practical. Certain conversations went differently when you were a visible priest, and there were elements of the conversation with Esposito that might benefit from a clerical register. But it was also something else. A return to himself. A reminder of who he was in this story, which was not the hero, and not the love interest, and not the Mafia connection. Who he was a priest, and priests oriented themselves by something outside themselves, and he needed that orientation now more than usual. Sarah noticed the collar. She didn't comment. Esposito himself came to meet them. He was younger than Antonio had expected, perhaps 45, olive-skinned, quick-eyed, with the precise haircut and careful suit of a man who understood that presentation was a professional tool. He shook Antonio's hand with 2 hands, which was a deliberate signal. "Father Rizzo, I'm sorry for your brother." "Thank you." Esposito turned to Sarah. He looked at her the way lawyers look at evidence they're hoping will hold up, assessing, professional, without warmth. "Signorina Voss, avvocato, you have materials for me?" "Yes." "Then come." He led them to a conference room, glass-walled, clean, a table that could seat 12. He sat at one end. Antonio and Sarah sat across from him. Luca, in his carrier, regarded the chrome ceiling fixtures. What followed was 2 hours of the most detailed deposition-style conversation Antonio had witnessed. Esposito went through everything systematically, the documents, the recordings, the financial trails. He asked precise questions and received precise answers, and took notes on a yellow legal pad in the small, compressed handwriting of someone who writes quickly and thinks faster. He expressed no emotion about any of it, which Antonio suspected was professional discipline of the highest order. At the end, he set down his pen. "This is significant," he said. "More significant than I had anticipated." He looked at Sarah. "You understand what this means. Once you give this material to my office formally, there is no undoing it. The people it implicates will know it came from you, eventually." "I know that," she said. "Your best protection, at that point, is the prosecution moving quickly enough that the material is already in the hands of the state before Casara's people can organize a response." He looked at Antonio. "Is she safe for the next 48 hours? "I intend to ensure she is," Antonio said. Esposito studied him with intelligent eyes. "You're a priest, Father. This isn't exactly—" "I'm also Marco Rizzo's brother," Antonio said, "and I was born in this world, which means I know what 48 hours of operational cover looks like, even if I chose a different career." A pause. "Fair enough," Esposito said. He looked at them both, at the priest, the former assassin, the infant in the carrier, and if he had thoughts about the composition of this group, he kept them where lawyers keep their thoughts. "I have a property in Posillipo, secure, staffed, private. I'd like you to stay there while we begin the filing process." "We'll need to be able to leave if necessary," Sarah said. "Of course. And I'll need someone with medical credentials on call." She paused. "I'm 7 months pregnant." Esposito blinked, his only visible reaction to any piece of information in the past 2 hours. He looked at Sarah's coat, which was quite good at concealing things. He looked at Antonio. Antonio did not flinch. "I'll arrange it," Esposito said. The house in Posillipo was not what Antonio had expected, which was foolish because he knew perfectly well what kind of property a successful criminal lawyer in Naples maintained as a secondary residence. It was a villa on the cliff above the bay, whitewashed, stone-terraced, with a garden that dropped in steps toward the water. Bougainvillea rioted over the walls. The interior was all dark wood and heavy fabric, and the sense of many comfortable seasons accumulated. A housekeeper materialized, showed them the rooms, produced food, disappeared. Antonio stood on the terrace and looked at the bay. Naples lay to the left, its layers, its chaos, its enormous, complicated beauty. Vesuvius rose on the right, snow-capped, impossibly stable above the sea. The light was doing something with the water that he wished he could paint, and knew he would fail. Sarah came out behind him. She had changed again, a softer look now, the combat readiness dialed slightly back, though not entirely. She stood beside him and looked at the view. "I have never been to Posillipo before," she said. "It's extraordinary." "Yes." A pause. "Antonio?" "Yes." "Thank you." She said it with the bluntness of someone to whom gratitude doesn't come easily, forced through resistance, arriving with effort. "For all of this. I know it. I know what you've put at stake." He turned to look at her profile against the bay and the volcano and the enormous November sky. "You'd have managed without me," he said. "Maybe." She turned. "But I don't think I don't think Luca would be all right." She looked at the child, whom she was holding now. "He hasn't cried since that first night. Did you notice? He's been calm. And that's partly luck, and partly his temperament, but partly—" She stopped. "He knows when something is safe." Antonio looked at Luca. Luca looked back with the gravity of the newly born. "Smart kid," Antonio said. "He's yours," she said. It was simple, a fact. "Yes. I want you to know that. I mean, I know you said you knew, but I want you to hear it from me. The baby I'm carrying is yours. I have not. There hasn't been anyone else. Not since Catania." She said it quickly, with the momentum of someone who has rehearsed and is getting it out before the rehearsal runs out. "I believe you," he said. "You don't need to. On faith. I can—" "Sarah." He kept his voice gentle. "I believe you." She stopped. She looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes, and this time what was in them was not measurement exactly. It was something more vulnerable than that, something that hadn't been built over. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Again, the fourth or fifth time she'd said some version of this, each time with a different, specific weight. "Neither do I," he said. And then, because it was also true, "But I want to find out." The bay held all its colours. Vesuvius stood its ancient, patient watch. Below them, Naples went on being Naples, magnificent, intractable, surviving. She leaned against the stone wall beside him, not touching, but proximate in a way that was deliberate, and they stood there until the light changed and the housekeeper knocked to say the dinner was ready, and they went in. They found out on the third morning in Posillipo. Antonio had been awake early, as usual. A lifetime of the office would do that, wire the body to rise before it was convenient. And he was in the kitchen with coffee when Esposito called. "There's a development," Esposito said. He said it in the voice that developments arrived in when they were the bad kind. Tell me. Casara sent someone. Not to the house, we believe he doesn't know this location, but to your church in Palermo. A pause. Your assistant, the older man? Salvatore. Antonio set down the coffee. He's in the hospital. He'll recover. But they went through the church looking for something. Books, files. They broke the relics case in the chapel. A pause. They were looking for information about where you went. Antonio was quiet. They found nothing? Correct. But this tells us something. Casara is escalating, not pulling back. The filing we began yesterday, he may have been alerted by someone inside our process, or he may have simply decided that the risk of waiting outweighs the risk of action. Esposito paused. Father, I need to know, is there anyone who knew your destination? Ferrante. Besides Ferrante. No one. Then the leak, if there is one, didn't come from your end. A longer pause. I want to move the woman to a second location. I have no, Antonio said. If she moves now, she's visible. Movement is risk. He thought. You said 48 hours for the initial filing. We've been at it for 30. 18 more. Can you accelerate? I'm already accelerating. Accelerate faster. He kept his voice level. Get the material to the state before this becomes irrelevant. After he hung up, he stood in the kitchen and looked at the bay through the window for a long moment. Then he went to find Sarah. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She had probably been awake for hours. She was in the sitting room with Luca, and she was looking at the door when he came through it, which meant she'd heard the call or its tone, if not its content. He told her. She absorbed it with stillness. Salvatore, she said. He'll survive. He's not the point. She set Luca down on the blanket. The point is that Casara is willing to assault a church and beat an old man. He's not observing limits. No. Which means the protection of sanctuary has its limits, Antonio confirmed. I know. I said 72 hours, and it held for 72 hours. Now we're in a different phase. She looked at him with an expression he was learning to read as, I need to say something you won't like. What? He said. There's another way to stop this, she said. Faster than the legal process. No. You don't know what I'm about to say. I know what the other way is. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to let you. It wouldn't be me, she said. I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm not operational. She watched his face. Marco had people. People who were loyal specifically to him, not to the family structure, personal loyalty. I know who they are, and I know how to reach them. She paused. They would move against Casara if asked. That's not... He stopped. I will not start a war to end a war. It wouldn't be a war. It would be a targeted Sarah. His voice was quiet and final. No. She held his gaze. You're sure, she said. I'm sure. Even knowing what Casara will do if the legal route takes too long. Even knowing that. He sat down across from her, because the thing that ends one way will end that way, with more dead, more consequence, more blood. And I will not purchase your safety at the cost of more lives. I won't. He paused. And I don't think you want me to. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said finally, I don't. Then we trust the legal route. 18 more hours. Yes. She looked at Luca on the blanket, then back at Antonio. And if it's not enough? Then we adapt, he said, like I said before. But we don't choose blood if there's another option. You really believe that? She said, not skeptically, genuinely. With everything I have. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone adding a piece of information to a model of the world they've been building, reassessing. Not won over, perhaps. She was too practical to be won over by conviction alone, but noting the conviction as a variable worth accounting for. All right, she said. 18 hours. They didn't sleep, neither of them. Esposito called at intervals, updates on the filing, on the state prosecutor's response, on the chain of notifications climbing the judicial ladder. Antonio sat in the sitting room with his breviary and his coffee, and the awareness that Sarah was in the next chair, and they occupied the night side by side, in a way that was neither romantic nor practical, but something specific to extreme circumstance. The companionship of people who have agreed to survive together. Around 2 in the morning, Sarah said, "Tell me about ordination." He looked at her. "Tell me what happens," she said. "I want to know what it was." He told her. He told her about the day, the cathedral in Palermo, June, the heat, the smell of incense and stone and flowers. He told her about the prostration, lying face down on the floor of the cathedral, while the choir sang the litany of saints, feeling the stone against his forehead, feeling the names move over him like water. Pray for us, pray for us, pray for us. He told her about rising, and the bishop's hands on his head, and the weight of that imposition, not metaphorical weight, actual physical pressure, like something being settled into place. He told her about the newly ordained hands, and the linen wrapped around them, and the smell of the chrism oil. She listened with her whole attention. It was the quality of attention she brought to surveillance and escape routes, but turned inward, toward comprehension. "Did you feel different?" she asked when he finished. "Yes, immediately." He thought about how to describe it. There's a word in Hebrew, kavod, translated as glory, but literally it means heaviness, weight. The divine glory in the Old Testament is described as something you can barely stand under, not light, not ethereal, but dense, present, immovable. He paused. That's what I felt. Not ecstasy. Weight. Not regret? Not then. He paused. Later there were complicated days. Like now. Like now, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how does someone decide that this is what they're for, this specific kind of life? He thought about it honestly. I was standing on a hillside outside Palermo at sunset, he said. I was 25. I had just come from something connected to Marco's world, something I'd seen that I didn't want to have seen. And I stood on the hillside, and I looked at the sea, and I thought, someone has to be the thing that goes toward the suffering instead of away from it. And I thought, I'm capable of that. And I thought, I am being asked. He paused. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't anything I can prove to you. It was more like an understanding that had been arriving for years, and that evening it arrived completely. Sarah was looking at him. "You went toward the suffering," she said. "I try to." "You're doing it now." He met her eyes. "Yes." "Is this—" She stopped, started carefully. Is this a pastoral project for you? Is that how you've organized this in your head?" She wasn't accusing him. She was genuinely asking, with the directness she brought to all difficult questions. "No," he said. "Then what is it?" He thought about what Ferrante had said. The complication is yours now. He thought about the vigil on the ferry and the conversation on the terrace and the small space above the cot in the room behind the sacristy where two people had not touched each other and had been very conscious of not touching. "It is the most personal thing I have ever done," he said, "and the most complicated. And I don't have a clean framework for it, because I don't think a clean framework exists." He looked at her. "You are not a pastoral project. You are a person I love who is in danger, who is carrying my child. I'm here because those are truths, and they require something of me." She was very still. "The vows," she said. "Yes, they require something too. I'm not pretending they don't." He pressed his hands together. "I have a meeting scheduled with my bishop when this is resolved. There are canonical processes. It will take time. It won't be clean." He paused. "I'm not asking you to wait. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you that the process has begun." She looked at her hands. "I've never prayed," she said. "Not once." "Okay. I don't know if I believe in anything." "That's all right. Doesn't it bother you?" "Why would it bother me?" "Because you believe very specifically in very specific things." "I believe God loves people whether or not they know about it," he said. "That's not a conditional love. That's not, you must first acknowledge before the effect takes place." He looked at her steadily. "What I believe, specifically, is that you have been cared for in ways you can't see, and that whatever you think about God is between you and God, and none of my business." She looked at him. "You're not what I expected a priest to be," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Smaller." He laughed, briefly, genuinely, and it surprised them both. The sitting room at 2 a.m. held the sound of it. She smiled. Not the surprised smile from the room behind the sacristy. This one was different. Warmer. Chosen. 18 hours, she said. 15 now, he said. They settled back, side by side, into the night. 12 hours into the filing, Esposito called with 2 pieces of news. The first, the prosecutor had reviewed the initial materials and was moving to open a formal investigation. Cassara's financial institutions had already been flagged for asset review. The state was moving. The second, someone had sent Cassara a partial transcript of Esposito's initial intake interview with Sarah. There was a leak. Not from Ferrante's end, not from Antonio's. From Esposito's office. Someone in the filing chain, someone who had seen the documents and understood their value and made a different calculation. Esposito delivered this information with the clipped efficiency of someone who has assessed their own culpability and decided on transparency as the best damage control strategy. He said, "I don't know who. I'm auditing the office now, But you need to assume that Cassara has a partial picture of what she gave me and knows she's in Naples." Antonio ended the call. He went to Sarah. She had already packed. Not everything. A specific selection, the essential architecture of flight. Flash drive in her pocket, the documents in their waterproof sleeve, Luca in the carrier, asleep. "You heard," he said. "I heard your voice change." "We need to move." "I know." She looked at him with that complete focus. "Where?" He had been thinking about this for 12 seconds and had arrived at a destination that was insane and obvious. "I know a parish priest in Salerno," he said. "Father Benedetto, my old confessor. He has no connection to any of this, and he owes me no explanation, and he will ask no questions." He was already reaching for his phone. 6 months ago he mentioned that the parish has a guest house, unused since the last visiting congregation. "Call him," she said. He called. Father Benedetto answered on the second ring, sounding as if he had been awake regardless, 70 years old, insomnia, the middle of the night. Antonio spoke carefully. Father Benedetto listened. There was a silence. "Of course," Father Benedetto said. "Come." Antonio looked at Sarah. "Car?" "Esposito's car. His driver is clean. I confirmed the security check myself when we arrived." "Then we go." They moved through the house with the specific, coordinated efficiency that exists between two people who have been watching each other operate for days and have absorbed each other's rhythms. No instructions required. Sarah took the door, Antonio took Luca. They were in the car in 4 minutes. The driver, Rosario, a man of few words and evident competence, took the coastal road south without being told twice. The sea appeared and disappeared on their right, black, enormous, absolutely indifferent to the quality of their emergency. In the back seat, Sarah said, "The filing is already in." "Yes." "The investigation is already opened." "Yes." "Even if Cassara finds us, even if he tries, the information is already moving. It can't be stopped now." "No," Antonio agreed. "It can't." She leaned back. She put her hand on her abdomen, a gesture he had seen her make before, unconscious, the gesture of checking in with something. "Are you all right?" he said. "The baby's moving." She paused. "She does this, especially at night." She glanced at him. "I think it's a girl." He absorbed this. "She." "Yes." A pause. "I don't know for certain. I haven't, with everything that's been happening, the prenatal appointments have been. We'll arrange proper care in Salerno." He looked at her. "She is well?" "She's very active, which I'm told is good." He looked at her hand on her abdomen. He looked at the curve of her, the presence of the new life, the impossible, ordinary miracle of it in the middle of everything. "What will you name her?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "of Maria." He was very still. "After my mother," she said, "who was named after her mother, who was Sicilian." She glanced at him, and in her eyes was something careful, an offering, held out tentatively. "Unless you have a... It's perfect," he said. She nodded, looked out the window. "Maria," he said, trying the name aloud. "Maria," she confirmed. The car went south in the dark, toward Salerno, toward Father Benedetto and his questions he would not ask, and in the carrier Luca breathed his small, steady breath, and Sarah's hand rested on the child beneath it, and Antonio, who had a quality of stillness, sat with all of it, and did not look away. Benedetto met them at the door himself, which was typical of him. He had always refused the management of things he could do directly. He was small, white-haired, with eyes that had seen everything twice, and maintained a benign clarity that Antonio had spent years trying to understand. He looked at Antonio. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Luca. His gaze travelled, briefly, over the arc of Sarah's abdomen. "Come in," he said. "I'll make tea." The guest house was 3 rooms off the side of the parish building, bare, clean, furnished with the austerity of a place used for clergy visitors. Stone floors, white walls, a crucifix in each room. It smelled of salt air and the wax that someone had recently applied to the floors, which meant Benedetto had been expecting them, or preparing for someone. They settled. Luca was put down in a cot the housekeeper materialized without explanation. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table and accepted tea and drank it with both hands around the cup, warming herself down to the centre. Benedetto sat across from Antonio. He did not ask about any of it. He was 70 years old, and he had been a confessor and a priest for 40 of those years. And he had learned, Antonio suspected, that most situations explained themselves adequately if you simply gave them time and kept the kettle on. What he said was, "Are you well?" "No," Antonio said, honestly. "Reasonably?" "More or less." "Then we can work with that." After the tea, he took Antonio outside to the small garden. The sea was audible, not visible, but the sound of it was everywhere, in the walls, in the ground. Benedetto put his hands behind his back and walked slowly, and Antonio walked beside him. "Your brother," Benedetto said. "Yes." "I heard. I said a mass." A pause. "He was not a good man." "No." "He was important to you." "Yes." "Both of those things can be true." "I know." Antonio looked at the dark garden. "You assigned me the Magnificat." "I did." 3 times, twice more after the first. Benedetto walked. "I think I understand something about it now," Antonio said, "that I didn't then. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones. That line. I always read it as triumph. Now I think it's a description. Just a description of what happens. The mighty fall, eventually and inevitably. And what survives is..." He paused. "What's hidden? The small things." The Child in the Manger, which is the oldest version of the story. Benedetto was quiet for a moment. "How far along is she?" he said. Antonio closed his eyes briefly. 7 months. Before your ordination? By 6 weeks. Benedetto walked. The sea moved in its constant commentary. "I won't lecture you," he said. "I know. I won't tell you what the process requires. You know. I won't tell you what it costs. You know." He stopped walking. He looked at Antonio with the eyes that had seen everything twice. "I will tell you that I have known perhaps 4 men in my life who were truly called to the priesthood. Not trained to it, not suited for it. Called. You are one of them." He paused. "What that means for the situation you're in, that's between you and God. I am not the arbiter." "What would you do?" Antonio asked. "If you were me?" Benedetto looked at him. "I would pray," he said. and I would not leave her. Those are contradictory answers. Are they? Benedetto resumed walking. The church has made accommodations before. Not easily, not cleanly, but the church is 2,000 years old, and it has encountered every possible human situation at least twice. He paused. There are Eastern Rite priests who are married. There are dispensations. There are paths through that are not climbing over walls. He looked at the garden wall, as if making the metaphor literal. But those are logistics. The question under the question is whether you can do both things, love her and serve. And that is a question only your experience will answer over time. Can those two things coexist? Every married deacon in the Western Church is an argument that they can. Benedetto turned back toward the door. I'm going to sleep, Antonio. Let me know if you need anything in the night. He went inside. Antonio stood in the garden and listened to the sea. He did not pray the Magnificat. He prayed what came, formless, wordless, the interior of a man who has arrived at the edge of his own map and is trying to read the territory beyond it. He stood there for a long time. When he came back inside, Sarah was still at the table. She had not slept. She looked at him. What did he say? She asked. He said, not to leave you. She held his gaze. Is that what you want? She said. It's what I know, he said. She nodded. Once, slow, the nod of someone accepting a fact. Then don't, she said. And that was that, which was also to say, that was everything. They found the guest house on the fourth morning, not Cassara personally. He was 200 kilometres north, managing the legal devastation that was beginning to descend on his finances as the state investigation opened its teeth, but two of his men doing the job he'd sent them to do before the legal situation became his primary concern. They had found Esposito's driver, and from the driver, through methods Antonio did not ask about, they had found Salerno. Antonio saw them from the garden, two men, dark coats, the particular posture of people who have been asked to find something and are close to finding it. They were on the street outside the parish wall, moving with the methodical patience of professionals. He went inside. Now, he said to Sarah. She was already moving. She had been ready since 3 a.m. He knew this without asking. She swept up Luca with one arm and the bag with the other and looked at him. Father Benedetto, she said. He's in the main building. There are parishioners. The church opened at 7. Good. She meant witnesses, numbers, the calculation of violence in a public space. Exit? Kitchen garden, through the back. It comes out onto Via Mercanti, away from the street thereon. She nodded. She moved. He followed. They went through the kitchen garden in the early grey light, past the rosemary that smelled sharply of itself, past the old well, through the gate in the stone wall that opened onto the narrow street behind the parish. The street was empty. Walk, he said, not run. Running was visible. Running was signal. They walked. 3 blocks. 4. He was counting cross streets, running directions in his head. This was what he meant when he said he understood the world he'd grown up in. The architecture of exit and approach, the geometry of how an old town's streets worked in someone's favour if they knew them. He had made one phone call the previous night, a contact in Salerno, the younger brother of a friend from seminary who ran a car service and asked no questions for people referred by Antonio's family name. The car was waiting on Via Roma, 3 blocks east. They reached it. Sarah got in. He handed Luca in after her and got in behind. Napoli Centrale, he said to the driver. The train station. Fast. The driver drove. Sarah turned to the back window. She was looking for pursuit with a practiced eye, checking, sweeping, calculating. After 4 minutes, she turned forward. "We're clear," she said. He let out a breath he'd been holding. "The train?" she said. "Rome, then we reassess." He was already thinking. "I have a colleague at the Gregorian University, a Jesuit, old friend. He'll house us without questions while Esposito's process runs to its conclusion." She looked at him. "You have this infrastructure," she said. "I grew up in a world that required contingency planning," he said. "I just apply it differently now." Something in her face relaxed. A fraction, a softening. "Yes," she said. "I see that." Luca, who had been observing all of this with his characteristic gravity, made a sound that might have been approval. "He likes trains," Sarah said. Something in her voice was almost light. "Then it's fortunate we're taking one," Antonio said. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the speeding car, in the morning light coming off the Campanian hills, something moved between them. Not physical, not yet, not quite, but the clear and present form of what would eventually be physical, the architecture of what was already true. She turned away first. He didn't blame her. In his pocket, his breviary, his phone with a message from Esposito. The investigation was moving. Cassara's primary accounts had been frozen that morning. The legal process was consuming its own momentum. They were not safe yet. But they were closer. The Jesuit, Father Castellani, received them in a study that was every inch a scholar's room. Books on theology, history, and moral philosophy stacked in the cheerful disarray of a man who reads 6 things at once. He was small and quick-minded, and when Antonio appeared on his doorstep with a woman in late pregnancy, an infant, and no explanation, he said, "You look terrible. Come in." That was the entirety of his commentary on the situation. He gave them 2 rooms in the university's modest guest accommodations, arranged for a doctor, a retired obstetrician who was also a member of Castellani's parish, to come and examine Sarah that evening, and produced from somewhere a selection of food that seemed to anticipate hunger across multiple categories. The doctor, a composed woman of 60 named Dr. Ferrara, conducted the examination with Luca parked on Antonio's lap in the waiting room, and Antonio trying to read his breviary and failing. She emerged after 30 minutes. "Mother and baby are well," she said. "Baby is in correct position, heartbeat strong. She is—" A glance. "The father?" she asked Antonio. "Yes," he said. She studied him briefly, taking in the collar. Her face did not change. "She is 30 weeks. The baby could come any time in the next 10 weeks, but ideally not for another 8. I would prefer she rest significantly." She paused. "She has been under considerable stress." "I know." "That stress should diminish now." "I'm working on it." "Work faster," Dr. Ferrara said, and left. He went in. Sarah was lying on the narrow bed with her hands folded on her abdomen, looking at the ceiling. She turned her head when he came in. "Well?" he said. "Well," she confirmed. "Both of us." She paused. "She's very active. The doctor says she's been active throughout, which apparently she moves when she's comfortable." Antonio sat in the chair beside the bed. Then she's been comfortable, he said, even with everything. Even with everything. Sarah looked at the ceiling again. She's been healthy the whole time, she said. Through the night we ran from Palermo, through the ferry, through Naples, through all of it. She's just... She paused. She's just been in there, growing. Life is like that, Antonio said. It came out simply, without the weight of aphorism, just the plain fact of it. Sarah turned her head toward him. Her face was open in a way he had not seen it be, the armour not removed but set aside, intentionally, a deliberate choice. "Sit here," she said. She meant the bed, the edge of it, beside her. He moved from the chair to the bed. He sat at the edge of it. She reached out and took his hand, not with urgency, not with calculation, simply took it and placed it on her abdomen. He felt movement, a distinct shift under his palm, something pressing back. He was very still. "Hello," he thought, to whoever was in there. "I'm your father. We have a complicated situation. I am working on it." "She knows," Sarah said. She was watching his face. "Does she?" "Something about your presence. She's been—" Sarah stopped. Her voice had changed quality, become careful. "When you've held Luca, or when you've been in the room when she's been active, she calms. And just now she gestured at what was currently happening under his hand, which was the unmistakable impression of pressure, as though someone very small was pushing back deliberately. "She's saying hello." Antonio kept his hand still. He looked at Sarah. "I have never," he said carefully, "felt anything like this before. I know. I have spent 3 years doing the most sacred things the Church asks of me, the Mass, the sacraments, ordination." He looked at his hand on her. "This is different." "It's the most ordinary miracle," she said. "That's what makes it. That's what you don't expect about it. It's the most common thing in the world, and it's still—" "Yes," he said. They stayed like that, his hand on her, the child pressing back between them, in the borrowed room in Rome, while outside the eternal city went about its ancient and ordinary business, and inside this room something was being made. He looked at her face. "Sarah," he said. "Antonio," she said. "I want to ask you something." "Ask it." "When this is over, when Cassara is dealt with and the legal process has run, will you let me be present? Not as a caretaker, not in any role that can be tidily defined, just present." She looked at him for a long time. "Define present," she said. "Here," he said. "Wherever here is, in the room. You're going to have to manage a great deal of church process. I know. It will be complicated and slow, and there will be, I know. And I'm not an easy person. I have noticed." The corner of her mouth moved. "You're impossible," she said. "I'm persistent," he said. "There's a difference." "Antonio." "Yes?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Be present. Be here." She looked at his hand, still resting where it rested. "We'll figure out the rest." He stayed exactly where he was and did not move, and the child pressed back again, and Rome continued outside the window, and the evening came. 3 weeks later, the arrest orders came. Esposito called on a Thursday morning. The state prosecutor had moved. Kasara's primary organizations had been raided. 17 arrest warrants had been issued, of which 14 were executed within the first 6 hours. Kasara himself had been in Zurich, which complicated jurisdiction but did not prevent the Swiss authorities from being contacted. "He'll negotiate," Esposito said. "He always negotiates. But the leverage is ours now. The testimony, the financial trail. He's finished, in any form that could threaten her." Antonio passed the phone to Sarah. She listened to the rest of Esposito's report with the same operative calm she brought to everything, and when she handed the phone back, she was quiet for a long moment. "It's done," he said. "The criminal part is done," she said. "There will be testimony, a trial, years probably." She looked at the window. "I'll be a witness. I'll need security probably, for longer than I'd like to think about." She paused. "But Kasara won't be sending people." "Not anymore." "No." She was still. "Marco's child is safe," she said. "Luca is safe." "Yes." "And—" She stopped. "And Maria," he said. She pressed her hand against herself. "And Maria." He had called his bishop the previous week. The conversation had been long and uncomfortable, and at several points appeared to be going in the wrong direction, and then Antonio had said something he would not fully remember afterward, something about the nature of vows and the nature of honesty, and what it means to honour the spirit of a promise when the letter and the spirit have come apart. The bishop had been silent for a long time after. He had not said yes, but he had not said no. He had said that there were processes, canonical processes, dispensation processes, and that Antonio should begin them formally if he believed this was his path. Antonio had said that he did. The bishop had asked him if he was certain. He had said yes, with the same certainty he had said yes in the cathedral in Palermo at 25, lying face down on the stone floor while the litany of saints moved over him. Different, yes. Same bedrock. He told Sarah some of this, not all of it. She listened. When he finished, she said, "You're not doing this for me." "I'm doing it for everything," he said. "You're included. You're not the reason." She looked at him for a moment. "You believe that?" "I do." "Then I believe it too," she said. And then, before he could respond, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." She turned fully toward him. She was enormous now, 32 weeks, and Maria's presence was unmistakable, a fullness that changed the way Sarah moved and held herself. There was something about the pregnancy that had altered her, Antonio thought. Not softened exactly, but loosened. Some internal architecture that had been load-bearing for so long that she'd forgotten it was not just her own skeleton. "In Catania," she said, "that night, you know what I thought after?" "Tell me." "I thought—" She paused. "I thought that if things had been different, if I had been someone with different coordinates in the world, if we had met at the harbour as ordinary people, just two people." She looked at him. "I thought about it for a long time." "And then?" "And then Marco introduced me to his priest brother," she said, "and he was you, and the world was not different at all. And I thought, okay, put that away. That was a closed room." He was very still. "But it wasn't," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't a closed room. It was more like," she thought, "a door I thought I'd locked, and it turns out I hadn't, quite." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had initiated contact. She looked at their hands together, and then up at him, and what was in her face was the total, complicated truth of her, the damage and the capacity, the wariness and the wanting. The woman who had mapped imaginary cities as a child, and then been handed a world of exits and contingencies, and navigated it with everything she had. "I love you," he said, plainly, without setup, the way the plain truth presents itself when you stop managing it. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's all?" "No," she held his gaze. "That's not all." She turned his hand over in hers, looking at it, his priest's hand, the one that had been anointed. "I love you," she said, to his hand, to him, to whatever complicated God was presumably paying attention. "I don't know what to do with it, and I don't know how this works, and I don't know—" "Neither do I," he said. "We'll find out. Together." "Together," he said. She looked up. He kissed her, carefully, the way you do something for the first time when you have been circling it for years, with more intention than impulse, with full knowledge of what it is. She kissed him back in the same way, and the world reorganized itself slightly around the fact of it. Luca, who was in his carrier on the floor, made a sound of complete indifference to the adult drama around him. They both looked at him, then at each other. Then they laughed, both of them, at the same time, for no reason that wasn't also everything. Maria Rizzo came into the world at 3:47 in the morning, on the 21st of December, in a private clinic in Rome, without fanfare or complication, 9 days ahead of the due date. Antonio was there. He had been told by various people in various contexts that the experience of witnessing birth was overwhelming, that it reorganized one's understanding of the sacred, that it produced a specific variety of awe that could not be arrived at any other way. He had assumed, with the small arrogance of someone who had witnessed considerable human extremity and processed it with equanimity, that he would handle it well. He had not anticipated the specific quality of inadequacy. Not distress. The clinic was competent, and Sarah was extraordinary throughout, conducting herself with the same focused capacity she brought to everything, as though birth were simply another operational requirement, and he was aware that this was both a trauma-informed coping mechanism and a genuine expression of who she was. He was not distressed. He was insufficient. Spectacularly, completely insufficient. Standing at the edge of something that required nothing from him and everything from her. And all he could do was hold her hand and be there, which he was, with complete consistency, from the beginning to the end. And then Maria arrived. She was red and furious and entirely specific, a person unmistakably from the very first second. She was put on Sarah's chest, and she made a sound of profound complaint about the world that she had been deposited into without her consent. And Sarah's face, in that moment, was completely open. Every piece of armour gone, not removed, but dissolved by something that had no respect for armour. Antonio looked at his daughter. She looked back, squinting in the light, with his nose and Sarah's eyes and the general demeanour of someone who has opinions about this. "Hello," he thought. "I'm your father." As if in answer, she made another sound, this one less angry, more investigative, and turned her head against Sarah's chest. He sat at the edge of the bed. He put his hand on Sarah's arm. She turned her head toward him, and her face was completely undone, shining, exhausted, present. And she did not say anything because there was nothing to say. He did not say anything either. Later, hours later, when Maria had been cleaned and swaddled and was sleeping with that improbable infant serenity, and Sarah had slept for 3 hours, and the clinic was very quiet, Antonio sat in the chair beside the bed and said his prayers. Not the office, not the Magnificat. He said, "Thank you," over and over, with the simplicity of someone who has no adequate language and uses the most basic one available. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Luca, who had been brought to the clinic by Father Castellani and was currently asleep in a carrier in the corner, made a small sound in his sleep. Maria breathed in her clear bassinet. Sarah slept. Antonio prayed. This was the shape of it, this particular gathering, in this borrowed room, with no clear future and no map, and nothing certain except the fact of what was here. He had given his life to the idea that love was the foundational structure of the world, the ground of being, the thing from which everything else derived. He had believed it abstractly, and then progressively less abstractly, and now, in this room, it was not abstract at all. He looked at his daughter sleeping. He looked at Sarah. Lord have mercy, he thought. And then, he already has. Spring arrived in stages. First in Rome, the parks and the window boxes and the smell of rain on warm stone. And then, as the months moved, in Palermo, where Antonio returned in March to deal with the church. He had conversations with his bishop that were not easy. He filed the first canonical documents with the assistance of a specialist in canon law, a nun, Sister Chiara, who approached the process with brisk efficiency and no visible judgment. There were meetings with a diocesan panel. There were processes. None of it was quick. The church moved at its own speed, which was geological relative to the speed of the world outside its walls. Antonio had expected this and did not resent it. What the church asked was for deliberation, for certainty, for the full weight of decision to be understood before it was made. And he understood all of that, having been the one who put the weight on in the first place. He returned to Rome on weekends. Sarah was in an apartment in Trastevere. Esposito had arranged it, practical and secure, near the School of Law where she had begun, tentatively and with considerable initial resistance, a program in legal analysis. She had a particular mind for it, the same precision, the same spatial intelligence, now applied to the construction and deconstruction of arguments rather than the construction and deconstruction of contingency plans. Her professor had called her, in the second month, ferociously talented. She had reported this to Antonio with the tone of someone filing information she didn't quite know what to do with. He had said, "I know Maria was thriving." She had Sarah's eyes, the dark, measuring gaze, and Antonio's manner, which was to say, a quality of stillness that made other infants in their baby group appear exhausting by comparison. She had, at 4 months, the gravity of someone who had decided early that the world was worth observing carefully. Luca had attached himself to her with the proprietary intensity of an older sibling who has found his purpose. At 10 months he communicated primarily in urgent gestures, "Come see, look here, attend," which Antonio found both endearing and remarkably on-brand for a Rizzo. On a Sunday in April, Antonio went to the cemetery in Palermo where Marco was buried. He went alone. He brought flowers, white ones, lilies, Marco would have thought them excessive, and he stood at the grave and spoke to his brother with the frankness he had never quite managed when Marco was alive. He told him about Sarah, about Maria, about the way the year had gone. He told him that Cassara's trial was moving, slowly, infuriatingly slowly, but moving, and that the evidence Sarah had provided was holding up to every legal pressure that Cassara's remaining lawyers could apply to it. He told him that Luca was extraordinary. He told him that he was sorry for what, exactly, he left General, because the list of things he could be sorry for on Marco's behalf was long, and he didn't want to be at the cemetery all afternoon. He told him that he loved him. He stood at the grave in the spring sunshine for a while. Then he drove back to Rome. In June, Sister Chiara called. She said the process was reaching a resolution point, not concluded, these things were never quick, but the panel had reviewed the case and the situation qualified for the petitioned dispensation. There were additional steps, there was paperwork, there was time, but it was moving. He called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear Maria in the background, investigating something from the sound of it, and the familiar, specific quality of their apartment's acoustics. "It's moving," he said. A pause. "Moving," she said. "Yes." Another pause. "How long?" "Months, still, but in the right direction." She was quiet. He could hear her thinking, the particular texture of her silences, which he had come to know in their considerable variety. "Come to dinner on Friday," she said, finally. "Luca has been asking for you." "Luca is 10 months old." "He has a very expressive face." A pause. "I've been asking for you." He was quiet for a moment. The fullness of it, these words, this woman, this life that was assembling itself from improbable parts. "I'll come Friday," he said. "Yes," she said. He hung up the phone and stood in the sacristy of the church on the Via dei Gelsomini, his church still, for now, for a while longer, and looked at the crucifix above the desk, his mother's crucifix, the one he had brought from Palermo. He had a quality of stillness. He used it now, not to hold himself together, which was what it had been at the beginning of all this, but simply to be here, in this specific moment, with everything it contained. "Thank you," he said. The evening light came through the old window and found the silver of the crucifix and scattered. The following December, on the anniversary of Marco's death, Antonio was no longer wearing the collar. He wore a dark jacket and a white shirt, and he stood in a garden in Trastevere at dusk, watching Maria, a year old, recently walking, magnificently unsteady, navigate the distance between the garden table and his knees with the focused determination of a person who has decided that falling is not a sufficient reason to stop. She made it. She grabbed his knee with both hands. She looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "There she is," he said. She said something that was not yet a word, but was clearly in the general family of words, an incipient meaning, a direction. He picked her up. She grabbed his jaw with both hands, which was a thing she had discovered she could do, and which she deployed with enthusiasm whenever possible. "Careful," he said, into her grip, which made her laugh. Ciro was at the table. She had a glass of wine in one hand, the good Sicilian red that she'd discovered, with enormous private amusement, she liked, and she was watching them with the expression that had gradually replaced the armed neutrality of the early days. Something open, something that allowed in, something that had learned it was safe. She had testified 4 times in the Cassara proceedings, each time with precision and composure, dressed in the same dark suit, her voice level throughout. Antonio had been in the gallery for the second and third sessions. She had not looked at him during the testimony itself, but afterward, on the courthouse steps, she had found his arm without looking and held it. Luca was inside with Father Castellani, who visited occasionally and who had, with the philosophical flexibility of a Jesuit, accommodated the existence of this family into his world-view without apparent strain. He and Luca had developed a rapport based on Castellani's apparently endless willingness to make silly faces, which Antonio found both undignified and endearing. The dispensation had come in October. Antonio had been in the canon law office when Sister Chiara had placed a document in front of him, her face professionally neutral, her eyes privately warm. He had read it carefully. He had signed it. He had walked out onto the street in Rome and stood in the October sunlight and had a feeling he did not immediately have a word for. Not relief, not triumph, not grief. Something more textured than any of those. The particular sensation of a conclusion that is also a beginning, of something ending and something opening. He had called Sarah. She had been with Maria. He had told her. She had said nothing for a long moment. Then she had said, "Come home. Come home." He had driven to Trastevere. She had opened the door. Maria had been asleep. They had sat in the kitchen with tea and not talked about the dispensations specifically. They had talked around it, toward it, the conversations circling something that had been circling since a night in Palermo, when she had come through a side door covered in blood, and he had looked at her across the nave and understood that the life he had arranged for himself had a door in it that he'd thought was locked. At some point, late, she had said, "What do you want?" "This," he had said, simple, complete. She had looked at him for a long time. "Then this is what you have," she had said. Now, in the December garden, the light failing in the way it did in Rome in winter, a slow amber diminishment, the city going copper and then rose and then grey, Antonio held his daughter and looked at the woman he loved. She was watching him. She was always, he had come to understand, watching him. Not with surveillance, not with the old assessment for threat, with the particular attention of someone who had decided that what was here was worth paying attention to. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About Catania," she said. "What about it?" "The harbour. 2 a.m. She looked at her wine. "You said you remembered what I said about the sea." "Yes." "I remember what you said." She looked at him. "You were talking about your brother, about why you'd chosen the church. You said, 'The world needs more love than it's getting, and I think I can contribute.'" She paused. "I've thought about that. I've thought about it for 6 years. He looked at her. "And I think you were right," she said. "I think you can." Maria, in his arms, made an imperious sound and reached for Sarah, which was also something she had recently discovered she could do. Sarah set down her wine and took the child, and Maria distributed herself between them, one hand on each, and looked at them both with the dark, measuring gaze of a person who has assessed this situation and found it adequate. Antonio looked at the two of them, at the garden, the last light, the city beyond the wall. He thought about the church in Palermo. He thought about his brother on the cobblestones. He thought about the ferry crossing and the harbour at 2 in the morning, and a room behind a sacristy, and a Fiat on a dark road, and a garden in Salerno, and a clinic in Rome on the 21st of December. He thought about prostration on the floor of a cathedral, while names moved over him like water. He thought about what it meant to give your life to the idea that the foundational structure of the world is love. Not soft, not easy, not the love that avoids its cost, but the kind that stays in the room, the kind that names things plainly, the kind that does not leave when the ground becomes uncertain. He had given his life to that idea. He was still living in it. "Come inside," Sarah said. "It's getting cold." He followed her in. The garden held the last of the light for a moment after the door closed. The amber falling, the shadows gathering, the city's ancient stones going dark in the way they had gone dark for centuries, indifferent to the stories enacted within. Then the light went. Then it was night. Inside, behind the closed door, someone laughed. The church of Santo Filippo Neri was full on a Sunday morning in May. Father Benedetto had come from Salerno for the occasion. He sat in the second pew, small and white-haired and serene. Father Castellani was beside him, which meant the two old men had spent the last 20 minutes in quiet, probably forensic conversation about theology, which would be either a beautiful dialogue or a minor ecclesiastical dispute, and Antonio had made peace with not knowing which. Esposito was there, Sister Chiara was there, Don Ferrante, 73 now, diminished but present, his eyes still sharp as cut glass, was in the third pew with a rosary in his hands and the expression of a man who has lived long enough to see the improbable become ordinary. Salvatore, whose ribs had healed fully, was in the last pew on the left, which was where he always sat. Antonio stood at the altar. He was not the celebrant. He was no longer in active ministry, which was its own ongoing negotiation with a self that had been organized around service for years. He was here as a witness, which was also a kind of service. The celebrant was a young priest from Messina, ordained that spring, who had asked Antonio to assist with the ceremony, based on a connection through Father Castellani. He was nervous. Antonio had told him, "The nerves are correct. Take them with you to the altar. They're not a problem to be solved." In the front pew, Sarah sat with Maria on her lap. Maria, who was 18 months old and had been told approximately 6 times to be quiet, and who was considering each instruction with the thoroughness of someone who takes requests seriously but hasn't committed to compliance. Beside Sarah, Luca, almost 2 years old now, serious with his father's eyes, held her hand. She was wearing something white. Not purely white, an ivory, warm, the colour of things that are old and good. Her hair was up, and there were small flowers in it, which Maria kept reaching for with concentrated intent. The ceremony was simple. Antonio had asked for simple, not minimalism, not a statement, but the thing shorn of anything that wasn't the thing. Do you take this man? Do you take this woman? In sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, so long as you both shall live. He had been told he could not be the one to say the vows. Canonical technicality, the specifics of his situation, the specifics of the arrangement. Father Benedetto had smiled at him when he explained this and said, "Does it matter who says the words?" He had thought about it. No, he had concluded. The words are already true. We've already lived them. The ceremony is just acknowledgement. The ceremony was acknowledgement. He stood at the altar's edge and watched the young priest from Messina read the rite, and he watched Sarah's face, the face he had been watching in one way or another since a night in November in Palermo, when she had come through a side door and changed the shape of everything. She was watching him back. When it was finished, the words said, the ring given, the moment arrived and acknowledged, she looked at him with her full dark eyes, and there was no armour in them, and no measurement, and nothing held back. He looked back with everything he was. Maria, apparently deciding that now was the time, said something that was clearly intended as a word. It might have been Papa. The assembled witnesses seemed to think so, and the laughter that moved through the church was warm and specific, the laughter of people gathered around a good thing. Antonio looked at his daughter. Hello, he thought, as he had thought on the first morning, and on the ferry, and in the clinic, and in the garden, and in 100 rooms across a year of finding out what this was. I'm your father. We figured it out. Mostly. Sarah was smiling. He went to her. Outside, the May light on the old stones of Palermo was generous and indifferent, the same light that had fallen here for centuries on saints and sinners alike, on fishermen and conquerors and priests and those who lived at the edges of ordinary law, on the dead in their squares and the living in their churches, on everything that the sea had not yet swallowed, and the stories that kept, against the odds, being told.